Welcome back to Casual Adult Coffee with Alicia.
And Cory.
So we are talking about sex on the first date. Something I haven't had in a long time, being that I've been married for almost 11 years and with my husband John for the last 13. So we had to poll a few people since Cory here is single. I guess he would have an opinion on that. So, Cory.
Well, I don't get sex on the first date as often as I'd like, but every guy wishes for it to happen. Then, as we were saying, polling our friends, and noticed that a handful of myths and misconceptions and cliches that go with it, and people start to have image problems to go with first sex on the first date.
True. So I had a lot of my female friends, I noticed, were actually okay with it, which I was a little surprised. Not that they were okay with it, but that so many of them were. But I think that comes back to the fact that the first date isn't what it was years ago. You've already chatted with this person online, exchanged pictures, FaceTime, probably creeped them a little bit on Facebook. You know, you've already gotten to know them. So it's just a matter of whether the chemistry is there.
Exactly. Like the first date, at this point, like technology has enabled it so far that a first date is technically just a minor hurdle. I like to assume that every human being wants to have sex. I mean, that's a fairly standard and consistent assumption.
It is kind of a biological need.
Exactly. So if I've talked on the phone, texted for a while, everything else, then the first date is really just your first physical interaction, shaking hands, if you will. If you haven't met the person, if it's your very first blind date, it would be a little awkward. In the 80s, like in my early 90s, in my teens, if I had sex on the first date, it would be wow, how did that happen? But in your now, this day and age, 99% of the time, you're like, I'm pretty sure that this one's pretty awesome. It's not the well, let's hope for the best. It's really, the first date is almost a confirmation that you, like I said, assuming all people want to do it, it's just yes.
Yeah, we're not talking about like the random bar hookup, the person you meet at the club one night. And that's a totally different style of.
Well, exactly. And I mean, as much as I don't know what the statistics are on how many people have had a one-night stand, I would bet more than 50% in the fact, and those don't really count as a first date sex.
Yeah, that's a totally different show.
Right. I was back in my 20s, I remember one of the guys I worked with at a warehouse, he joked around and said he would never go to a second date if he didn't get lucky the first date. And I was kind of amazed, because I was like, every date you've had? And of course I was younger and less suave than I am today. So it was like a amazement mode. But I didn't get it as often back then. But today and age, it's almost, I wouldn't say an expectation, but
because you should never expect.
Exactly.
That comes back to, don't go into a date expecting.
Right.
But I think that the misconception that, if you sleep with somebody on the first date, then you're not somebody they're going to bring home to meet the parents, is kind of an old...
It's an antiquated belief.
But
at the same time, one of my female friends that I was chatting with, she'd said the first date, and again, she's texting, she's Facebooking, she's doing all these things, but she'd still said a no-go on the first date, the intimacy level isn't 100% sure. So for her, I think the first date, whether is still just the confirmation card, she's in her 40s, so maybe that adds a factor to it. But
no, because a lot of the ladies that I polled were also in their late 30s, early 40s. Also said that if that spark isn't there, what's the point of moving forward?
Agreed. And that's, well, and you did text me that. You said it's a nice confirmation of the chemistry.
Because I had one lady that I spoke to who said that she did wait with somebody and the relationship was going beautifully. But it turned out when they finally did move forward and have sex, that there was no chemistry and it ruined everything. And if they had known that early enough, that maybe they could have saved themselves both a lot of stress and heartache.
Well, and see, we'll go back to that topic in a future episode for sure, in the fact that if you waited and the relationship is strong, assuming that people are teachable and you can learn things, for example, if the sex isn't 110% on the first day, big surprise. I mean, you're nervous,
But if it's at 10%, and then you try again a couple of times and it only gets it up to 15%, and it's just a case of no chemistry.
Oh, then yes. Okay.
You know, if you're at like 75, you can work with that.
True. The funny part is the guys I talked to were actually a little bit, let's go with split. Is it didn't seem to matter, their respect level for the woman wouldn't change at all. If they met her, shook hands, took her to bed, actually didn't change their opinion of her at all. They said, that's what, I mean, we're all human beings. We have that biological drive. They were okay with it. I mean, I think men have already made that decision before they get to the first date mark, especially if they've seen them, if they've texted to them, everything else. To me, the first date is a confirmation that everything that they've led up to is true. I mean, I'm going to go on a limb here and say that guys have already made the decision and have done it already, thinking of the new girl. So meeting her in person, saying she's exactly like I had hoped, is really just the magical step that you're like, now I want to confirm it. And this goes back to online dating, which will be another episode, is if she's different in reality than she is on text, that it kind of deflates everything.
I think that goes for us too, that if you're different than you presented yourself, pictures, texting, on the phone, then yeah, things probably aren't going to turn out the way that everybody hoped.
Well, and that goes into, then at the same time, if she's not what I'd hoped, then this is the slutty part of me, says, I really don't see a long-term connection, but I might be able to fuck her today. So then...
Yeah. And you know what? We're kind of the same way. You're not exactly what we hoped, but there's enough of an attraction that maybe I can get my itch scratched.
So maybe that's... And then it's how much of a first date was it? Because again, then the sex itself didn't alter my opinion of them as much as it just... Like, I'd already made that decision before that, whether I was going to follow through with it.
Okay, so it's more how the person presented themselves during the date, not the sex itself, that determines whether there's going to be a second date.
Totally. One of the interesting things I thought, or like we said, both of us had texted some of our associates, and the one that was, it's almost their value or frame of reference, how they interpret sex. If a person was very casual minded about it, they would actually didn't have a problem with sex on the first date at all. Whereas, and it's weirdly enough, I find young people are, I think the fact that they can get sex so freely thanks to free internet porn and free dating sites and all these things, that sex itself is so readily available that, like, back to the other one, the intimacy level isn't there. So I think if they value sex, it throws off their interpretation of the time schedule. If sex is very valuable to them, like, that's it. Everybody can have sex. If everything is there, then they might go, you know what, it was so amazing, I want to wait a little bit longer and confirm that, because that's just it. You want to make sure that it is something special.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I don't want to say an obstacle, but it's one of the things that presents itself that if you've got that spark, then waiting for the date number 2 or 3 or whatever magic number it's going to be isn't an issue either, because everything else lined up.
That makes sense.
But, and that's the thing is, I actually had thought the younger, because my work, I work with a handful of like late teens, early 20s, and I thought that it was going to be the opposite. Because sex was so readily available, I thought that they would be like, oh yeah, I'll jump in bed today. But it actually worked out the opposite, and they were like, don't see the need for it. And I wouldn't say need is a accurate term either, but it wasn't an imperative selection. Because, like we say, because sex is so readily available, I think that they were actually willing to hold off.
To look for the intimacy.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sex doesn't equate intimacy. Intimacy is something that grows. Sex is just a physical activity.
It can be. I mean, I recognize some of my own, let's go with emotional limitations, and I do use sex as an expression of my intimacy and connection.
It can be, yes, but sex in itself is an activity. It is a way
agreed.
to express intimacy, but intimacy itself is something that grows out of a relationship as the relationship grows.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's like you said, if the chemistry's not there in the first date, you generally have an idea if there's going to be follow through.
Yes.
If it's like the first time, and I've had first times that were like kind of disappointing, and the second time wrapped it up. I've had times that the first time was amazing, the second time still the same. I mean, I'm not saying that it has to be fireworks and 4th of July every time or Canada Day. The trick is that you have to, because you can have sex with literally anybody with consent, that's the trick, is the intimacy and the connection are entirely what follow through with how date number 2 and 3 will proceed.
Yes.
Or
if, yes.
And that being said, I think too many people misinterpret the fact, like you said, there is this cliche that, oh, you don't bring her home to mom if you slept with her on the first date. I'm like,
also, we don't necessarily bring you home to dad.
well, and that's I actually had a girl say to one of my friends, well, he's not the kind you marry.
Yeah.
And I was vaguely insulted by it, but it was also like 2 decades ago, so I don't know, let's go with...
Not the type you brought home to dad?
I didn't care. Well, part of me was like, I already screwed her, who cares? The other part of me was like, well, what the hell is that supposed to mean? In retrospect, with the benefit of hindsight, she wasn't the type of girl that I would have ended up with long term anyway. And that's where sex on the first date, I can see it clouding that vision, that then you're like, well, I had sex, now the rest of it's got to be perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's
where you force the relationship and don't realize that it was just a physical activity.
exactly. And I can't say I haven't done that.
Well, I think that is our show for today. So thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit subscribe so you can see what we come up with next week.
Actually, a handful of comments from our friends and associates have mentioned that in retort to our blowjob episode, they actually want to see what it's like to female oral sex. So that's our next episode. It's going to be going downtown.
Until then, enjoy coffee.